Good morning, everyone. I want to start today by having you think back to a classic film that I'm guessing a lot of you saw in your younger days, the movie Cars. Do you remember what Cars was about? I know it was about Lightning McQueen. He got stuck in this little town in the middle of nowhere in the American Southwest, Radiator Springs. But what was happening to Radiator Springs in the film? If you recall, it was a dying town. But do you remember why the town was dying? Well, it was dying because it was situated on Route 66, a curvy, windy stretch of road going across the American Southwest. The problem for Radiator Springs was that the United States federal government had recently built an international highway system. The idea of the international highway system was clearly to be able to get from point A to point B more quickly, and that meant long, straight roads. What the movie doesn't discuss is why the federal government finally decided to build this interstate highway system. Going back all the way to Alexander Hamilton, some people had been pushing the federal government to do this to improve the American economy. But it's not until the idea of an interstate highway system to help the United States win the Cold War where this becomes a palatable idea for a lot of Americans who work in government. So, in fact, the story of Cars is a story of the outcomes of the Cold War. You could say the exact same thing for the 1980 Olympic hockey Miracle on Ice story. It wasn't just a matter of hockey because, frankly, most Americans don't care that much about hockey, but it's because it was taking place during the Cold War. For the better part of 50 years, Americans in school had to take and pass the presidential physical fitness test. Why were Americans required to do this? Again, this was put in the context of the United States winning the Cold War. The trip to the moon in 1969 was put in the context of winning the Cold War against the Soviet Union. On a more serious note, 58,000 Americans died during the Vietnam War, with an exponentially higher number of Vietnamese. And from the American perspective, this was once again about the Cold War. So the next chapter going forward is about the first 7 years of the Cold War. If you take a look at the top of the screen there, though, I've framed out a longer framework for what the Cold War is. If you look at different historians, they're all going to have slightly different takes, like with many eras, on exactly when something begins and when it ends. So what I want to do here today in this short lecture is talk about why I'm situating the beginning of the Cold War at 1945. We won't worry about the end of it yet. That's coming on chapters down the road. So we're going to start the Cold War, or thinking about the Cold War as a product of the end of World War II. This is information from our last chapter as well. But if you recall, after the invasion of D-Day in 1944, after Hitler's failed counterattack in the Battle of the Bulge in the winter of 44-45, it became pretty clear that the Allies were going to defeat Germany. The real question as we moved into late winter, early spring was what would victory look like, which meant that the Allies, both the United States and the Soviet Union, essentially were racing to have as much influence and control over as much of Central Europe as possible, and that centered on Germany. The map at the bottom left shows all of Germany, but it shows it broken up into the divisions eventually agreed upon at the end of the war, which largely followed where the troops were when Germany surrendered. What you see in Eastern Europe in the red, or in Eastern Germany in the red region, that would be under Soviet control and influence. In theory, they were supposed to just help govern Germany until Germany was able to construct a new government, but it became pretty clear that they had no intentions of allowing a free East German government. In the western part of Germany, you see the other three European allies, England, France, and the United States. And once again, the vision was that they would begin to institute their ideals, what they were fighting the war for. So even before World War II is over in Europe, it's very clear that the rivalry is between the United States and the Soviet Union. While the war was still going on, the United States and its allies began constructing international organizations to help govern how the international community was going to act from this point forward. The picture you see below is from the United Nations, specifically the Security Council of the United Nations. This was also a way that the Cold War was going to, in a sense, be fought. So if we're talking about the Cold War, let's try to define what it is, when it is, and where it came from. So we're looking at the origins of the Cold War really beginning in 1945, even before World War II was over. And the idea was that both the United States and the Soviet Union, in attempting not only to win World War II, but they were trying to win it in such a way to construct a world that would act in their own interests. Again, we are allies, but we are rivals. In our last unit, you spent the better part of a day looking at primary sources on the United States' decision to drop the atomic bomb, or their atomic bombs. And there was a lot of discussion within the United States government about how this was going to impact our relationship with Russia, the Soviet Union, after the war. It was definitely a part of the discussion and the decision to drop the atomic bomb that it was not just enough to win the war, but we needed to win the war in a way that would give us leverage after the war. So the question becomes, what exactly is in the interest of the United States and the Soviet Union after the war? So this might be another way to define what exactly the Cold War is. Oh, and I want to go back to this language of the Cold War. Typically what's implied in calling this the Cold War is the idea that the United States and the Soviet Union never directly went to war against each other. Instead, there were a series of proxy wars, wars in other countries in which the United States and or the Soviet Union and China would support the militaries of different countries, some cases intervene directly, but the United States and the Soviet Union never directly went into widespread combat against each other. Despite that, the Cold War was constructed of a series of hot wars. We call them the Korean War, the Vietnam War. There will be conflicts in the Middle East and Central America that are all part of this wider Cold War. So going back to what exactly did the United States and the Soviet Union think were in their own interests? Some think about the Cold War as a competition of ideals. If you could for a moment, think back to the ideals set forth in the 14 points in the Atlantic Charter by the United States, where President Wilson and President Franklin Delano Roosevelt set out what the goals and values were for each of those world wars. And on the political side, it was very clear that those were wars for expanding democracy. The United States, starting in World War II, very clearly took on the mantle of being an active promoter of democracy around the world. So some people think about the Cold War as this competition between democratic governments in which average people have a voice in those governments versus a more authoritarian style of governing on behalf of the Soviet Union, one in which average people have little to no voice in the workings of government. So some people prefer to think about the Cold War as a competition between democracies and authoritarianism. Within the Atlantic Charter and the 14 points, it was not only about self-governing nations. There were also clearly economic considerations. And from the perspective of the United States, that meant the promotion of capitalism. Capitalism in which individual people, they own property, they make decisions about how to use that property on their own, and they use that to enrich themselves. That's the ideal of capitalism. Along with that, typically goes free trade, that countries that are allowed to freely trade with each other with a reduction of barriers to trade, especially thinking about tariffs, that's going to promote a better economic situation for its citizens. On the Soviet Union side, they promoted the ideals of communism. I want to make a note here. Communism, again, it's not a political system. There is no political system or government that's called a communist government. People use that language, it doesn't make sense. That would be like asking how tall I am and somebody saying 400 pounds. It just doesn't really make sense. Sorry. Communism is a system of government in theory that has never truly existed. Rather, they were a socialist government in which the government itself had primary control over the resources of a nation. They would decide what's produced. They would decide who would get the benefits of that production. So in contrast to capitalism, where individual people are making the choices, in communism, government is making more of the choices. Some people prefer to think about the Cold War as this economic competition across the globe. So the real question here is, how exactly does a country win, in quotes, a war in which there won't be direct military conflict between the two parties? Um, that's kind of what our task is over the next couple of days. You're going to begin reading chapter 26, sections 1 and 2, that do a little bit of review over some of the details over the conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union in 1945 and 1946. And following that, the first several years of the Cold War under President Truman and the strategies the United States employed to try to begin to win this Cold War.